Welcome. I want to thank you for coming to the final installment of our year-long discussion series on advancing health and social justice. My name is Stephen Swartzer, and I'm the Associate Director for Academic Programs in Fordham University's Center for Ethics Education. The Center for Ethics Education, which is directed by Dr. Celia Fisher, was established in 1999 as an interdisciplinary cross-campus unit at Fordham. The Ethics Center embodies Fordham's commitments to intellectual excellence, social justice, and human dignity through the promotion of ethics education, research, and public dialogue. Our programs include an interdisciplinary master's degree program in ethics and society, an advanced graduate certificate program in healthcare ethics, the HIV and Drug Abuse Prevention Research Ethics Training Institute that has provided a significant amount of support for our talk series, and an undergraduate bioethics minor. In addition to these academic programs, we are also excited to have public-facing ethics and social justice programming that engages people in conversation about issues of contemporary social import. So this brings us to today's conversation about alternative visions for criminal justice. So not surprisingly, as we were planning our events for this year, questions about health were looming very large in everybody's mind because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And as we all, heard and have been hearing, this pandemic has not been affecting everybody equally. And this has helped to cast important light, but still perhaps not enough light, on pervasive health disparities and questions about health justice. In addition to the ongoing pandemic, last summer, the country was faced with the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others at the hands of police officers, along with the brutal law enforcement responses to widespread protests of racialized police brutality. And this was also a catalyzing moment, bringing renewed urgency to addressing longstanding problems that are built into our systems of policing and punishment. So when we planned this event, we didn't know that we would be talking about these issues in the middle of Derek Chauvin's trial in Minneapolis for George Floyd's murder, or in the face of the officer-involved killing of Dante Wright this past weekend, only a few miles away from where that trial is being held. And so given this particular moment, I think once again, this brings renewed urgency to identifying and addressing some of the systematic problems with our systems of policing and punishment, and urgency to develop alternative approaches. And so we're really excited to bring together a great panel to help us, think through some of these problems more deeply, and about the values and ideals that should guide us in developing alternative systems. Okay, so to introduce our panelists quickly, Dr. Vanessa Wills is a political philosopher, ethicist, educator, and activist working in Washington, D.C. She is assistant professor of philosophy at the George Washington University. In 2019-2020, she was also the Dodd Visiting Chair in Ethics and Practice at Ludwig Maximilian Universität's Munich Center for Ethics. Her areas of specialization are moral, social, and political philosophy, 19th century German philosophy, especially Karl Marx, and the philosophy of race. Dr. Wills is on the editorial board of Spectre Journal, a biannual journal of Marxist theory, strategy, and analysis. She received her bachelor's degree in philosophy from Princeton University and PhD in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh. Second, we will have Krisanne Vaillancourt Murphy, who is the executive director of Catholic Mobilizing Network. Krisanne has 25 years of experience working in national level faith-based policy advocacy. For more than a decade, Krisanne served as the senior church relations staff at Bread for the World, a collective Christian voice urging our nation's decision makers to end hunger at home and abroad. She is co-author of Advocating for Justice, an Evangelical Vision for Transforming Systems and Structures. Krisanne previously served as the executive director of Witness for Peace, was an associate with the Latin America Working Group, and served for a year in a faith-based domestic service program working alongside migrant farm workers in Woodburn, Oregon. She has a master's degree in theology from Boston College. And then finally, we will have Kira Shepard, Common Justice's Vice President of Organizing and Policy, who has been a racial and social justice advocate for nearly 20 years. Before coming to Common Justice, she worked at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, where she led a campaign that called for New Jersey's 3 youth prisons to be closed and led the organization's police reform work. Prior to that, she served as the Racial Justice Director at Columbia Law School's Law, Rights, and Religion Project, as the Executive Director and Director of and then she was the Director of Campaigns at the Black Institute and worked at Color of Change, as well as the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Public Policy Center and Make the Road, New York. Kira graduated from Rutgers Law School, Newark, with a Juris Doctorate degree. Now, before I hand things over to our panelists, I just want to give you to say a little bit about the procedure for this session. So for the first part, each of our panelists will be giving some relatively brief remarks, and then we'll have a conversation between them and all of you. And we really do hope that everybody in the audience is part of this conversation. We are excited to include questions from the audience and contributions from the audience. And to do so, we ask that you use the private chat feature for audience questions to submit your question to me via the private chat. And so we encourage you to include those questions at any point during the conversation. And now, with no further ado, I would like to throw it over to Dr. Vanessa Wills.
Great, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much to Fordham University and to all of the sponsoring partners for this event and this series. I'll take a moment out of my time just to say thank you to everybody who has their cameras on, and I know we're all sort of in different situations, and it's the end of a long academic year, at the end of a, in the middle of a pandemic. But for those of you who are able to turn cameras on, it's appreciated, because I think this really has to be an energy exchange to whatever extent is possible, right? So I want to begin by naming the fact that I'm not okay, and I think that is really important to make space for. And it is something that people who are oppressed in various ways experience, but are often not allowed the space to name, or there's a shame in naming that this violent system is in fact having its intended effect and wearing you down. And so I want to start with that, right? It's already, right? We already have the backdrop, the kind of constant thrum, right, of the Derek Chauvin trial, right? Which I, like many other Black people I know, have been mindful and judicious, right, about how much of it I watch. Because there's something violent about just the fact of the trial, right? This kind of mass gaslighting exercise. And the fact that our two outcomes of the trial are that either Derek Chauvin will be acquitted, which is a possibility, right? As much as we see the trial and see that it's this kind of open and shut case, or should be, it's a very real possibility he'll be acquitted. The other possibility is that he is convicted of some or all of the charges, and that too functions as a kind of legitimization, right, of the system, that somehow that is going to mean that the system doesn't require radical overhaul because it's capable of policing itself, right? And so there's a kind of trap, a kind of double bind, right, of the trial, where we know that because of the conditions within which the trial exists, the trial, whichever path it goes down, always means continued police violence for the communities that were victimized by the man who should be on trial but isn't, right? It's actually George Floyd who's on trial, the witnesses that are on trial. And now we have the more recent killing of Dante Wright by a police officer, also in Minnesota, a police officer by the name of Kim Potter. Makes this ridiculous claim that I'm not even going to dignify by repeating, but she, as you might expect, she has an excuse. And there's a couple many things to note about that, but the ones I'll draw out here to sort of open up my comments. One thing that I think became known today is that George Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross, was Dante Wright's teacher in school. So you see these, this kind of multiplication of trauma, right? And these communities and people interacting with one another, right? This is people loving each other, having a romantic connection, people educating one another, educating the youth, educating a child, right? These are human connections between human beings being ripped up, cut down, burned, right? Murdered. And then there's also, and this relates as well to the question of the trial and to, what are our recourses and what is the larger political space? And by political space, I'm talking about power, right? What are the relations of power that govern all of this? And we have this president, right, Joe Biden, who made a similar remark with respect to Dante Wright as he's made in previous times when Black communities have been harmed and have cried out. He says the following thing. He says, it's really a tragic thing that happened, but I think we've got to wait and see what the investigation shows. The question is, was it an accident? Was it intentional? That remains to be determined by a full-blown investigation. But in the meantime, I want to make it clear again, there is absolutely no justification, none, for looting, no justification for violence. I'm going to repeat that last sentence. No justification for violence. But when it comes to the murder of Dante Wright, we have to wait to see what the investigation shows before we can make any comments about that, right? So it's not true in this system that there's no justification for violence. Certain kinds of violence can be explained away, might be totally permissible, right? And certain kind, and looting, right? It's taking a pair of sneakers, that, no justification. We know that's wrong. No investigation is necessary. We don't need to know anything about the mitigating circumstances to understand that that's wrong. Right? So pulling out, broadening our lens from these particular instantiations, right, of this state violence and this disrespect. We might ask, right, what do we do, right? What do we do? And I, like others, right, in the footsteps of others, in the footsteps of people like Angela Davis, right, believe that what we need is an abolitionist program. And so I want to talk a bit about why I think not just this moment, but the history that leads up to it ought to bring us to that conclusion. So we've had attempts, we've had exercises in holding individual police responsible, and as I mentioned, we're in the middle of one very famous case now. And that is highly limited, right? So one reason why is the one that I named earlier, right? That this is occurring in courts that are designed to create stability, right? Designed to maintain law and order. And as I've written in previous work, Black people cannot free themselves. We cannot have an end to racism. We cannot have an end to this oppression and violence without a massive upheaval, without radically disruptive activity. This is something that Martin Luther King Jr. recognized and insisted upon and defended throughout his career up until his death. He called it the introduction of a creative tension. He was extremely critical of those who called for what he calls a negative peace. A negative peace is stillness and calm in the face of injustice. It's not valuable and it's not worth having. And so any meaningful and effective attempt to uproot something as ingrained in our society as the oppression of Black people is going to be disruptive. That doesn't mean violent, right? In the sense of actual physical violence against human beings. King himself, of course, famously, right? A proponent of nonviolence, but not a proponent of negative peace. And negative peace is what the police function to maintain. Negative peace is what the state and the courts function to maintain. We're not going to see an answer to this come from those places. Their remit, first and foremost, is to contain, suppress, keep in line, right? Maintain order. Another reason why that is, and Stephen, could you give me wave your finger when I have 5 minutes left, maybe. I haven't been keeping track. Okay, thanks. Another reason to be skeptical, right, that this is going to be that this sort of individual judgment of individual police is going to get us very far. Although, it's worth having. It's a victory that he has to stand trial at all, right? But we know that it's, as protesters in St. Louis said, the whole system is guilty, not just one police officer. The whole system. Derek Chauvin had his job for many years through many complaints, was well known to be an abusive man, and was in charge of training. On the day of George Floyd's death, Derek Chauvin committed that action while training. One of those officers was on his first day of the job, being trained by Derek Chauvin. So this is not an individual rogue police officer. This is a system that rewards this kind of behavior and sets it up as something to emulate, something to induct new recruits into. And then we have to ask why that is. And I'll say a bit and I'll just end here. Yeah, great. Thank you. So we have to ask why that is. One response that emerges right away, reasonably, when the demand to abolish the police is raised, or the demand to defund the police is raised, is the following. Well, how could we abolish the police in a world that's like ours? Look around, right? We need some force that provides these functions. And the response is that we don't want a world like ours. That's the entire point. What we want is a world that's fundamentally unlike ours. And so the demand to abolish the police is a demand to envision and produce a fundamentally different world. It's a demand, it's designed precisely to inspire us to ask exactly that question. Is this world that we're in now one that could exist without this systematized violence and destruction? And if the answer is no, then that ought to be an indictment of the conditions within which we live. So that's the project, right? That is the project. The project is to envision a world in which people have what they need, in which the kinds of links between lovers, friends, family members, students, and teachers that have been destroyed in Minneapolis and around the country and around the world are treasured and can exist. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to remind the audience that you can submit questions to me at any point along the way. So we definitely encourage you to submit questions. And then now, Krisanne.
Well, I just want to thank Vanessa for really for the way you started off and just acknowledging this space and this grieving and this wound that remains unhealed, open, and infected in our society. And I'm grateful to be with you and Kira. I'm grateful to the Center for Ethics Education, to Fordham, and to all of you who are here this evening to sit in this space and to envision this different way of being that you've called us toward, Vanessa. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So Krisanne Vaillancourt Murphy Catholic Mobilizing Network, as you heard. And I'm going to talk about the death penalty in the United States. I'm going to talk about one of the vestiges, one of the oldest vestiges of racism, its connections to slavery and linkages to lynching in the Jim Crow era is prevalent and pervasive. And we work on ending the death penalty every day and also promoting restorative justice, a different way of responding to harm and crime and violence in a way for a Catholic organization. For those of you who maybe have a faith perspective, we like to think of restorative justice as aligning well with our Catholic social teaching principles and with more gospel values. So I'm going to talk about that a bit too. So I want to just, oops, can you see anything? Hold on one second.
Just your desktop.
Yeah, all right. 1 sec, all righty. Can you see, you can see the slides now. Yeah, okay. So Catholic Mobilizing Network's been around for about 12 years, and we believe that each person has God-given dignity, no matter the harm one has caused or suffered. Those are some ways that you can get in touch with CMN, you know, catholicsmobilizing.org. There's a pretty expansive website. We're on, you know, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and that's just a little bit about how you can learn about us more. In terms of the organization, you know, we believe that we value life over death, and we seek to end the use of the death penalty, transform the U.S. criminal justice system from punitive to restorative, and to build capacity in the U.S. to engage restorative practices. And how we do that is we amplify the church's pro-life teaching on capital punishment. And again, we're promoting restorative justice through education, advocacy, and prayer. And we were founded in 2009 as a response to the US bishops who had called for a campaign to end the use of the death penalty. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that if we were really going to end the death penalty, we were going to have to create a kind of a lay-led national effort that was grounded in these approaches so that we could mobilize people. We could really get this done. And so we had folks like Sister Helen Prejean at the table with us. We had murder victim family members. We had death penalty abolitionists, exonerees. We had a diverse group of folks around the table who were aligning forces and teaming up together to actually, again, change the way the system works here in the United States. Since the beginning, we've been about the advocacy of ending the death penalty, but again, always recognizing that it's out of this philosophy of a more restorative approach, seeking healing, not just punitive measures, but reimagining alternatives. We want to repair injustice, and we think restorative justice can help us get there. So in terms of church teaching, in case you didn't know what the Catholic Church teaches in general, it's just been a couple of years since we've had this new clarity. For many years, there was grayness around the church's position on capital punishment. And it's not that the US bishops weren't working to end the practice, and it's not that popes weren't being clear, but there was this little clause that said, it could be appropriate in very rare circumstances. And so then everyone became judge and jury and was deciding that every incident of grave harm was, in fact, cause for using capital punishment. And because there was that unclarity for many years, I would say that there has been a lot of confusion in the church and among Catholics in the pews about what the church's position has been. But in 2018, Pope Francis, after he had been here in September of 2015, when he called for the abolition of the death penalty before the US Congress, which was a pretty compelling moment, he had been saying many things and trying to clarify, move the teaching along. And gratefully, he and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith revised the catechism. So that's, of course, one of the rule books for the church. And it said that in light of the gospel, the church teaches that the death penalty is inadmissible because it's an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. And the church, works with determination for its abolition worldwide. So there's clarity now. There is crystal clarity, no confusion. There's no circumstances for using the death penalty. So that's pretty clear and pretty great now. And then I just want to draw your attention to a more recent social encyclical that came out in October of 2020, so just last year, where the Holy Father called on, the church. He had so much to say. It's such an amazing document that really, he doesn't use the word or the term restorative justice, but he does talks about, how we should look at forgiveness, what it is and what it isn't, and memory and truth telling and making amends and accountability. And he talked also about, let us keep in mind that not even a murderer loses his personal dignity, and God himself pledges to guarantee this. So he also said that there was no stepping back. So it's a couple of years after the change in the catechism, and he said, listen, we're not stepping back from this position. So anybody who wants to push back on this inadmissibility thing, he said, yeah, you got nothing, holds no water. We're not going back to being any bit for capital punishment. So in terms of restorative justice philosophy, perhaps it's new for some folks on the call. There's no single way to define restorative justice, but at CMN, we tend to describe it this way. CMN defines restorative justice as a principled approach to justice that emphasizes living in right relationship and resonates deeply with gospel values and Catholic social teaching, where human dignity and relationships are violated by harm and injustice. Restorative justice upholds human dignity, builds relationships, seeks healing, and enables transformation with individuals, communities, and systems. Back to what Vanessa was talking about. So that's kind of our perspective on restorative justice. Again, there's certainly Christian underpinnings to this approach, but we absolutely acknowledge that the global practice of restorative justice goes well into indigenous peoples and to our Native American brothers and sisters and communities that have used these practices well before. So certainly are standing on their shoulders. So the theory behind restorative justice is really perhaps best seen when you can compare it to the common traditional justice system that we kind of live in. And so the traditional justice system asks questions like, what was the crime, who's guilty, and what should their punishment be? Whereas restorative justice asks a different set of questions: what the harm was, who was impacted, and how, and what needs to be done to make it right. So it seeks to, again, create circumstances where you can get to more root causes of harm, and then you can help to rebuild and restore relationships that are broken in the process. In terms of practices, there are, and I'm hoping that we'll hear from Kira with common justice work, which is so profound in this area. But restorative justice has distinct practices around victim offender dialogue or peacemaking circles. And there's so many ways that using the values and the principles and practices of restorative justice brings you to a totally different way of, again, approaching the harm and addressing the harm. And so just to paint a picture, especially the picture on the bottom here, this is a circle process. So you see a circle and you see that there's no head of the table. There's often in circle process a talking piece that is brought around the circle so that everyone can have that freedom to speak freely, and they can have their moment, their time for speaking. There's a speaking in order. There's an opportunity to share deeply and listen deeply without interruption. Again, back to the talking piece. And then, it can be used in instances of harm, but also other instances to facilitate community building, prayer, reflection, addressing conflict, or just simply having space, holding space for challenging topics. On a larger scale, processes that are restorative justice related might look like truth-telling and reparations, those that are seen in following apartheid with South Africa, or with Indian residential boarding schools in Canada with the First Nations peoples. So there can be restorative justice practices used at more of a systemic level as well. I'm going to switch course a little bit here now that I've laid a bit of groundwork around restorative justice. And then I'd like to share with you some of our advocacy work on ending the death penalty. Again, we see it as the tip of the iceberg for the broken criminal justice system. It's the most punitive, immoral practice. It has the ability to snuff out life. And it's different than there's a lot of bad practices and terrible injustice in our criminal legal system. And Vanessa was talking about, policing, and there's again enough injustice. We could talk for a long time, but in terms of our overall system, this is one of the most punitive. And So that's what we have decided to work on with laser focus. And we also believe it's something that we can change. The momentum's on our side and the trends are in our favor. So I did want to give you a sense of what that looks like in the US right now. So as the map shows you, basically there is a sea of red. There is a sea of red in terms of states that still have the death penalty. But I think just to paint the picture for you, the states in lavender, there are 23 that have now repealed death penalty. So it's no longer on the books, in their laws in those states. The 3 purple states are those that have governor-imposed moratoria right now on executions, which is often a first step toward repealing the practice in that state. And even of the red states that you see, which again have death penalty on the books, probably about 10 to 12 of those haven't executed anyone in 10 years. So that's a good thing in terms of, the country moving away from the practice. So, just because if you don't work on this every day, you may not know there's 2,500 people on death rows across the country, and that's both at the state and the federal level. Alone on the federal death row, which wreaked havoc over the last year with the Trump administration and the 13 executions. I'll say a little bit more about that, but there are 48 people left on the federal death row. And, in the modern era of the death penalty since the 70s, it's incredible to see how many mistakes were made. 185 people have been exonerated in this many years since, 1973, because they didn't commit the murder. They had the wrong person. And so, so those are just sort of a little bit of snapshot by numbers. So in terms of abolition, at least for the death penalty milestones, looking back since 2009, so the last, 10 or 12 years, you can see the red line is the annual death sentences. And there were 118 of those in 2009. And, now today we hovered about 30 death sentences a year. So there's been some tremendous efforts by defense attorneys and the legal community, to date, activists and such. The blue number at the bottom is annual executions. And again, we went from about 50 a year in 2009 to about half of that right now. So there's some incredible progress. And again, it shows you states along the way that have repealed and or declared a moratorium. So you can see there's just real momentum moving in our direction. I want to talk about Virginia because it's a really big deal that the state of Virginia just repealed the death penalty. And I'll tell you why. I love this picture because I think it is a perfect visual for how the anti-death penalty movement looks right now. You have Governor Northam, who of course has just signed the bill. It's the first Southern state to get rid of the practice. And he is flanked by Republicans and Democrats, so it's bipartisan, by people of color, by activists, by faith leaders. And that is kind of what the movement looks like. And what I loved about this press conference, in fact, was that, Governor Northam talked about this as being the moral thing to do, and I couldn't agree more. But he also called the death penalty in Virginia. He talked about its history. He talked about its connection to lynching and the fact that, Virginia was notorious. It has executed more people in the United States than any other state. And I often think of Texas as being the state, that's just so well known for the death penalty and for executions. But frankly, it's Virginia that holds the highest number of executions, since the Commonwealth began. So since 1608, there have been nearly 1,400 100 men and women who were executed there. And obviously that was so connected to lynching and the slavery kind of situation in Virginia. And so when Governor Northam signed the bill, he was recognizing this sordid past. He was saying it was time to do something and that we have so much work to do. He called the system of capital punishment fundamentally flawed, and he said it has no place in the Commonwealth or in this country. And again, I think that is what we're hearing more and more as states just tick away that practice altogether. I just want to point out a new study. I know we're going to talk some about, the racial injustice and underpinnings that are part of the system of the death penalty and also many parts of our criminal legal system. The Death Penalty Information Center is an excellent clearinghouse for really great research on the death penalty. And they came out with a new study, Enduring Injustice, the Persistence of Racial Discrimination in the U.S. Death Penalty, just in September. And it confirms so many aspects of the historical roots of capital punishment that we recognize more and more each day. Again, I talked about the fact that there's direct links to slavery and lynching. And we know that race affects every stage of death penalty cases. Prosecutors are more likely to seek death if the victim's white than if the victim is Black. Black citizens are systematically excluded from capital juries. And it goes on and on. And so I just want to point that out to you. It's an excellent report and so worth looking into if you're interested. I want to talk to you just a sec about what's happening in other individual states. So we had this great victory of Virginia and, again, it's so very exciting. We have a fair share of opportunities and challenges, and I'll start with one of the state challenges. The state of Arizona is one of those red states from our map that hasn't executed anyone for, since 2014. So, 6 or 7 years. There was a terribly botched execution of Joseph Wood in that state, and they halted executions for some time. The current Arizona Attorney General has just, within the last 2 weeks, called for setting execution dates again. And so that's terribly troubling. And we may see Arizona with an uptick in executions in short order. So it's one of the states that we're watching. I also want to tell you about these other states that are listed. It's right now, it's legislative assembly, time in states. And so we're watching several other states really closely, like Florida it has the largest death row next to California. So we always keep a close eye on that state. And they just had a bill that would prevent those with serious mental illness from possibly getting the death penalty. So they're chipping away at the law on their books, which is excellent. And then in the case of Nevada and Ohio, they're both moving forward with repeal bills. And I don't think, in all honesty, that they're going to make it all the way. But every year that we can get further and further, and we can do the right education, and we can, take advantage of the political seasons to do education and advocacy, we get a bit closer. So I just wanted to point those out. Just the last couple slides here. I can't talk about the death penalty again without just saying a few more things about what happened recently federally. The Trump administration was doggedly pursuing a restart to federal executions after 17 years of not having any. And so, this is a situation where there were other presidents before President Trump that could have declared a moratorium, that could have tried to take it out of federal law and didn't, and there are probably a lot of political reasons why that didn't happen. but President Trump became, he took office and he was out for blood. You know, he talked about it in his campaigns, and he went for it. And after, again, many, many years, he restarted federal executions with a vengeance and set as many execution dates as he possibly could get on the books. And he did that right up to a week before inauguration. And so this list is the individuals in the 7 months of that killing spree. Honestly, it was traumatic. These are the individuals that whose lives were taken. And that doesn't mean that, you know, in these cases there weren't crimes, but none of those individuals needed to die, and we know that. Daniel Lewis Lee was killed despite his death warrant expiring, and that's how it started, the execution spree. The next was Wesley Ira Perkey, and he had schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. He didn't even know what he was charged for when they took his life on July 16th. Lesmond Mitchell was the first Native American in this spree. And that, you know, again, went against tribal law and against national treaties. So it was just one tragedy after the next. We're in a different era now with a new president who is publicly opposed to the death penalty. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But I just also want to say that I think that there sometimes is this misunderstanding or this misconception that, you know, some states have gone rogue and they still use the death penalty. And, you know, even though we're moving away from the practice in the country, but, oh, the gold standard is, you know, is the federal system. And frankly, the federal system and the states that are using the death penalty all suffer from the same flaws. And these are those, you know, it's an imperfect system. It's deeply flawed. We know that it's so racially biased. We know that if you're poor, you're much more likely to get a death sentence, et cetera, et cetera. We know it's racially biased. It's geographically concentrated. You can tell the various counties across the country that use it and vast areas that don't use it. You can honestly boil it down to the prosecutors and state attorney generals. It's quite something. And the rest of the country is moving out of the practice. So for the same reasons that we oppose state executions, we oppose it at the federal level. So right now, we're in a situation that's somewhat different. We have a president who has talked about on the campaign trail being opposed to the death penalty, but we know that President Joe Biden, he's evolved on this issue. You know, when it came to the crime bill in 1994, he was for ratcheting up sort of criteria or who could get the death penalty. He's moved along on the issue, and that's encouraging. But frankly, we need to keep him accountable. So he's nearing 100 days in office. We have a national petition. Right now, you'll see it on the screen, and you can get it on our website, catholicsmobilizing.org. But we're basically asking President Biden to declare a moratorium. He can do that today. He's got the power to do that. He can also commute all the sentences, those 48 sentences on death row. And then we're asking him to use his political will and, you know, prioritize working with Congress and the states to remove it from law. So that's from federal law. And then he can also incentivize the states to move them further along as well. So we're asking President Biden to prioritize honoring the dignity of life and ending the federal death penalty. We need not look much past a couple months ago to see just how terrible it can be with, again, when things go off the rails. And then lastly, a couple just thoughts. I've already mentioned the petition. Catholic Mobilizing Network, we often, you know, uphold the book and movie, the film Just Mercy, because it tells such an amazingly powerful story about an innocent man on death row, but it also so much of the ugly tentacles of racism that are embedded in the system are on display in that movie. That book is a truth teller. And so we created a Catholic study guide. And you don't have to be Catholic to use it, but, just some more of the reflective kind of questions that help you work with the book and with the film. And then if you're interested, in addition to calling for an end to the federal death penalty, we have for every execution date that's set for imminent execution, we have the Mercy in Action program where you can write letters to the boards of pardon and parole and to governors in those states. We also hold prayer vigils every month for whoever is up for execution, no matter where. So I just wanted to give you a couple ways to a couple handles to be involved in ending the death penalty if you feel called to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And once again, a reminder to the audience that if you would like to have us ask a question for the panelists, please do contribute the questions to me via chat. And now we will have our final panelist, Kira Shepard.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for those two powerful presentations, Krisanne and Vanessa, and of course, Stephen and Fordham. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. I am at an organization called Common Justice. So we're the first alternative to incarceration organization in the nation that works with people who have been charged with a violent offense. So working with people who have been charged with like gun violence, assault, between the ages of 16 and 26. And our process is somewhat of a restorative justice process, depending on your definition of restorative justice. A lot of people see restorative justice as a system that's like totally outside of the criminal legal system. We do work with the criminal legal system in a sense that we divert people out of the system. So we work with district attorneys' offices. We're based in New York City to divert folks out of the system. And if they successfully complete our program, their felony is like erased from their record and either becomes a misdemeanor or a violation. And our program is an over a year-long program. And part of it is we do one restorative justice circle. But a lot of it is just working with the responsible party, which is traditionally known as the offender. We move away from words used by the criminal legal system because we're all about abolishing the criminal legal system. So I'm right there with Vanessa with that. And so we bring together, we work with the responsible party and the harmed party, provide them services and talk to them so the responsible party can really look at the ways that they harmed the harmed party and can really be held accountable before we bring them together in the restorative justice circle. And oftentimes, if the harmed party, the victim, doesn't want to go into the restorative justice circle, we have like a surrogate step in for the harmed party. And with that, that's basically how our direct services program works. But we also have organizing and policy division of our work as well. And we're kind of guided by like 4 principles. And the first principle is survivor-centered response to violence, in that we, through the work that we've done, through the work that I've done, even before I came to restorative justice, we've become aware that a lot of survivors actually don't want to see the person who caused them harm like be punished. They want to see them be held accountable, but they don't want to see them be punished. And oftentimes, Black men are disproportionately survivors of crime. And oftentimes when you have community member, family members who've been touched by the criminal legal system, and you know how horrible it is, you don't want to see people go through that. One example I often give is, it was a long time, like 20 years ago when I was working at a social service agency. We were doing, this is a pseudo restorative justice program where I was working with youth that caused harm. And I remember there was this 16-year-old boy who he burnt his family's house down. So that's why he was in the program. So he caused harm, but he was also harmed, and he was also a victim. And I remember him telling us that he was raped by someone, a man in the community when he was younger. And I asked him what he would like to see done to that man. And I remember him saying, like, when it first happened, he wanted to like tie the gentleman around a tree and put a bullet through his head. He said, but after a while, he realized something had to happen to that man in order for that man to do what he did to him, you know? And so he wouldn't want to see harm done to him. And oftentimes we see a lot of the survivors we work with, they say the same thing. And when we go to people who are victims of a crime and ask them, do you want to see the person who caused you harm go through our program or go through the criminal legal system? 90% of the people say go through our program, basically. So that's the survivor-centered approach that like kind of guides our work. And also we use the term survivor instead of victim because we move away from terms, like I said, used by the criminal legal system. And our definition of survivor is someone who's been harmed by violence, any type of violence, and people who have been heavily impacted by systems of oppression. So that includes the criminal legal system, because we know that a lot of violence happens within the criminal legal system in prisons, as Krisanne and Vanessa just pointed out. So that's why we use survivor instead of victim. And plus the term victim has been used by the criminal legal system to cause more harm because the criminal legal system used the plight of the victim oftentimes to like get at the bleeding hearts of the public to try to put more people in prison, incarcerate more people. Matter of fact, the person who started the victims' rights movement wasn't a victim at all. He was a lawyer and a cop. His name was Frank Carrington. I always show his book cover because it's like such a like provocative book cover. But he worked hard to push back against a lot of the laws that came out of the Warren Court in the 60s and 70s, which was a very liberal Supreme Court. In addition, during that time when he was like talking about the need to punish people because of victims, during that entire time, we saw a rise in the amount of and in the incarceration rates around the nation because there was like a big push to just throw the book at people. I mean, Angela Davis talks about this in her book, Why Prisons Are Obsolete. And she talks about how during that time, like in the 70s and 80s, when they started to like shut down like welfare altogether and take services out of the communities, they didn't know what to do with a lot of these people. So they just started putting them behind bars. You see this with the carceral feminist movement, the anti-violence movement, which really worked to end domestic violence and sexual violence. When it first started, it was like this multiracial, diverse group of women who were actually trying to get to the root causes of the problems that were happening in our communities. But that didn't happen quick enough because that was too complicated. So then they just started working with prosecutors in the criminal legal system to advance laws that would basically lock people up and basically cause more survivors. So that's a little bit of the history of like one of the reasons, another reason why we don't use the term victims, instead we use survivors. Another one of our guiding principles is safety-driven response to violence. And one thing that we say at Common Justice is that there's 4 drivers of violence. One is shame, one is isolation, another is poverty, and another one is exposure to violence. So if you think about all of those things, like these are the things that drive violence. Like if you think about the criminal legal system, like in prisons, like those are all the things that actually drive more violence. So then when people actually leave, they're not rehabilitated, you know, they're actually harmed even further, and then they're going to cause further harm in their communities. And you could just imagine how the cycles of violence keep going. So for us, we are about preventative responses to violence, such as I was saying before, putting more services in our communities that we know that people need so they don't have to resort to violence, which includes like mental health care, housing, employment, education, parent-child classes, And we think part of that is even abolitionist strategy, because we know that so much money goes into the carceral state. Like if you would be surprised, New York Police Department each year, their budget is $10 billion, which is crazy. And you could just take a small chunk of that and put it back in the communities, and that would help prevent violence in so many different ways. And another guiding principle for us is racially equitable responses to violence. And when I talk about that, I talk about the fact that, there's violence happening in our communities a lot, and oftentimes people don't report it to the police. So what's happening to those people who are being harmed? How are they being taken care of? What type of services are they getting? Our system is so tied to people reporting to the police to actually show that they were harmed that so many other people are just totally being ignored. Like, for instance, the Bureau of Justice came out with a statistic saying that Black women are more likely to be victims of assault by someone who's not an intimate partner. And also low-income Black women are oftentimes unlikely to leave their community very often. So oftentimes low-income Black women are assaulted by people in their community. And because of that, they might not want to report what happened to them to the police, because they know that they might run into that person the next day or the next week. Beth Rishi, a criminologist, calls this the trap of loyalty. So that's one reason people might not resort to the police when they're actually harmed. So what happens in those cases? And then also, we know Black people in general, people of color, Latinx people, they don't trust the police. They don't feel safe by the police. They often feel dismissed by the police. So unless we're actually putting services in our communities that are helping people who are being harmed and who don't want to go to the police, we are causing more violence, and we aren't addressing a lot of the harms that are happening in our communities. And then lastly, another guiding principle that we have is accountability-based responses to violence. And this goes back to the restorative justice circle, so in the restorative justice process. And the problem with the criminal legal system is that when someone caused harm and they go through the criminal legal system, oftentimes they can sign a plea and they can have to pay back the state in whichever ways the state finds necessary, and they don't even have any type of interaction with the person that they harmed. So unless you really have a conversation with the person that you harmed to really dig into how your actions harmed them, a lot of times you're not going to walk away feeling accountable. Howard Sear, the person who wrote the little book of Restorative Justice, he said that studies have shown that most people who caused harm, or just put in basic terms, like most offenders, believe that they were the actual victims, because they believe they're the victims of this horrible criminal legal system that didn't give them a fair shot. And you know what? They're not entirely wrong, to tell you the truth. So and so many people I know who've been incarcerated, they feel like they were victims of the state, and they come out just mad about the state and not really thinking about, oftentimes, sometimes, not all the time, what they've done. The great thing about restorative justice is that it not only provides a sense of accountability for the person who caused harm, but it also provides a lot of healing for the person who's been harmed too. So oftentimes when someone has been harmed, when there's a victim and they go through the criminal legal system, for instance, if someone has been robbed or their home has been burglarized, they might not know why they were burglarized. They might not know if they were targeted. They might not know if the person's going to come after them again. They have so many questions they need to have answered. And they don't have those questions answered when they go through the criminal legal system, because like I say, oftentimes they don't even have a chance to talk to the person that caused the harm. So through the restorative justice process, putting the people together not only allows us to come to a sense of accountability, but it also is very healing for both people who are involved. And that's what Krisanne was saying. It's just like, it's a healing process. And we know that the criminal legal system process is a very harmful process that actually just causes more violence. So I'll just end it there. Thank you.
So thank you for that. And once again, thank you to all of our panelists, and let's give them a quick round of applause to all of them. And so a reminder to the audience, please do submit questions for all of the panelists or for any one of them. But I want to start off by asking a question that I do think connects up some of the things that all three of you were getting at. And that has to do with the way that the criminal justice system. So to just set up a little bit, it seems like when we're thinking about issues of violence, right, trauma is like impossible to ignore, and you would think that a system should be trying to address that trauma. Right, address the trauma and things like that are caused by violence, but our system does not seem at all to do that. Instead, as you've all pointed out, the system in many ways creates additional trauma, either through police activities or through capital punishment or through incarceration and other things. So I'm curious if anybody can speak to why do you think that there is this major disconnect between what seems like any system should be addressing and the fact that our system completely ignores it and makes it worse?
I mentioned in my talk, this response, there's no excuse for looting, right? There's no excuse. And what was striking about this was that, lots of things, but one of them that Biden actually gave a basically identical response in the summer of 2020, when there was a police killing that happened in Philadelphia. His response was exactly the same, right? It was like, well, this is too bad. There's no excuse for looting. And there the question was, what would you say? The question he was asked by a reporter, what do you have to say to people in the city of Philadelphia who are upset about what happened? And the response was, it's too bad, but there's no excuse for looting, right? The question wasn't about looting, right? And it's not just him, right? This is sort of, I mentioned him just because, this right now is, of course, like the voice of sort of a certain kind of like liberal mainstream response to this, and it's quite indifferent, and it's the same. Obama gave similar kinds of responses, and oftentimes, and I think this like dovetails so perfectly with the points that Kara raised. Oftentimes, especially when it comes to people of color, we're told that the solution is tough love, right? Whether it's in classrooms, we talked about the school to prison pipeline. So whether it's in classrooms and the way that children of color are treated, whether we're talking about the fact that children of color are typically perceived by whites as being actually older than they are, right? Whether we're talking about the kind of widespread social trauma that erupts in a community as rioting, right? As protest, as sometimes breaking windows, right? The thing that people of color get is tough love, which of course is a misnomer. The love is usually missing, right? And it's just the toughness, right? And I think that it goes hand in hand with a whole practice of dehumanization, right? Of not recognizing people of color as human beings who have feelings, right? Who have every right to be upset, every right to be angry, to cry, maybe even to throw something, right? There's never any kind of conception of the totality, right, of what is going on that might produce these responses. To go back to King, right? King called a riot the language of the unheard. And he said, I don't want riots either. That's why this is in his words, Dr. King, he said, that's why I am wanting to look at a society that produces riots, right? What are the circumstances that lead us to this point where the only way that people can express that outrage at their dehumanization is through the means of the riot, right? That's not, we as a society have a way of beginning and ending our analysis with the individual person violating whatever, rights of private property, which we care a lot about. And we don't think about the rights of that person that have been violated, right? That have brought us to this point where there's no other way, right, to be heard. And so I think, and so that's a kind of like social ethical response, and I think also, I think this comes up, with, I don't want to speak for either of my co-panelists, but in what Krisanne and Kira were saying, I think, it also speaks to a criminal justice system that has no way of countenancing the humanity of individual people and doesn't want to, right? And isn't set up for that, and is premised on, treating people's lives like trash to be thrown out, destroyed, right? And so, I think we would need a complete kind of ethical reordering. But in order to do that, we need political activism. We need to have a society where the people who are most affected by these oppressive systems actually have a means of exercising power, because otherwise people will take whatever opportunity they have, right, to make themselves heard, which I am into, frankly. You cannot exclude people from every possibility of having a voice or being treated like a human being, and then be surprised that they resist, right? But what would be better is if we had a system where people could be included, right, in decision making about the things that matter in their lives.
Krisanne or Kira, would you like to react to what Vanessa said, or to some of the broader questions?
I think just a couple quick thoughts about trauma. They say that if trauma is not transformed, it will be transferred. And I think there is so much collateral damage to the harm that people experience. I just want to share with you all one quick story. And, it has to do with the criminal justice system's kind of lack of being able to understand the backstory of some of these incidents of crime. And Kira kind of mentioned that, about this boy who had been raped, right? And I mean, there's so many instances where there's just such tragedy. And if you can't take the totality of the story and understand where it's coming from, where this harm is coming from and breeding, then you're just perpetuating the cycle of violence. In one of those 13 people who were killed this summer, in the execution spree, in fact, one of the very last was a woman. There was only one woman of the 13 who were executed, and her name was Lisa Montgomery. And it was such a tragic story. She was sex trafficked by her parents. She was forced sterilized. She had been, she had been given out for, sex favors to handymen that came to her parents' house. I mean, it was just terrible. And the stories of her childhood, and her crime was, she ended up murdering a woman, and she cut the baby out of her stomach, so she forcibly removed, the woman was pregnant. It's a terrible, terrible, tragic story. She was on the federal death row. She was killed at Terre Haute in January. But what was so painful in that was realizing this awful, terrible backstory of Lisa's suffering. She never had a childhood. And yes, she committed a terrible crime, but when you understand where the trauma that she had suffered, you almost understand a little bit as to how that crime could happen. And it's never, defended or excused, but at the same time, it's like, my gosh, there has been so much trauma here. And you see that rampant in the stories around those who are sitting on death row. But I'll also say that what we find more and more is, as we're becoming more trauma informed as a nation, even corrections staff, those who have to administer lethal injections, those who are part of, the cadre of people who take the lives, during the executions, the damage that's done. And they're able to speak about that. Some are later. And even, so we're seeing people, kind of reckon with this now that there's language around it. And I think what we can do as an organization like CMN is we can help share stories of how people have grappled with the trauma that really exists, so that we can create more space for others to tell those stories, so that we can stop those cycles of violence.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And thank you for lifting up Lisa Montgomery's story. Her story is really sad. Yeah, and on that note, just about like trauma, I mean, it's such a complicated conversation too, when you talk about incarceration, when you talk about Black and Brown people, but Black people particularly, we talk about like endure so much trauma on this soil, from slavery to lynchings to Jim Crow to what's happening now with the policing and the criminal legal system, and all that trauma, all that violence has impacted our communities, but when you look at the criminal legal system and the laws and how they just lock people up, none of that is taken into account. And that's incredibly problematic. And then also just to the heart of the question, like, why are these institutions not addressing the trauma? I'm going to go back to Angela Davis and what she said, and some people might be skeptical about this, but it's Angela Davis. How can you question Angela Davis for one? But like, she talks about the fact that, like I said, in the 80s, we saw a rise in the incarceration rate because of the fact that states had to put folks somewhere after they closed off a lot of services. And during this time, there were laws being created, a lot of drug laws, arbitrary drug laws were created, a lot of drugs. A great example of this is like the marijuana laws were created. And I know so many people who were incarcerated for like 15 years, and they told me the first time they actually went to prison was based on some marijuana law. And then it just created the cycle for them, right? And now all of a sudden, like, marijuana is like legalized all around the nation, right? So were there any need for those laws? So I think there's something to the fact that these places weren't built to address trauma. These places were largely built to lock up poor people, Black and Brown people.
So connecting up some of these things, there's two questions from the audience that I think are very similar to one another and connected, and so I want to bring them together. So Vanessa mentioned the relationship to negative peace. So MLK also explained that many Black people are, quote, forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, end quote. What impacts do you think abolishing the police will have over the mental health of Black and Brown communities, especially following the racial tensions of last year? And then the connected question is, how do we stop a floodgate of clan-like domestic terrorist attacks that will terrorize Black communities? I already fear the police and white grievance and racism embedded within it, but I also fear even more unchecked white grievance if no one is around to stop it. In short, I'm conflicted.
Yeah, so for the first question, I mean, there's one really direct answer to give, actually, which is that when we talk about abolishing and defunding the police, a key part of that is taking the massive amounts of resources that are lavished upon these militarized occupying forces in communities across the country and redirecting it to services that are actually meant to serve the community and help the community rather than police and control it. And that's going to include things like mental health services. We talk often about having social workers and people who are trained in mental health care respond to a number of these calls, right? Oftentimes the police, in fact, escalate situations rather than de-escalate situations that could be pretty handily de-escalated by someone with some basic mental health training. And not just funding the most obvious examples of mental health care, but it's bad for people's mental health to live in communities that are left into states of disrepair. It's bad for your mental health to be stressed out about whether you're going to pay the rent next week, to live in a space that's overly crowded, to worry that you are going to get COVID-19 at your low-paid job and bring it back and kill your family with it. There's so many ways in which our society is organized in a manner that exhibits complete disregard for the things that are minimally required to attend to people's needs, including their emotional and mental health needs. So one kind of answer is, I think there's like a very, very direct connection there. And especially when we look at the history of the increase in these funds being given to police, and it occurs essentially right in tandem with these resources being drawn away from a mental health infrastructure that existed, and that did need to be altered and improved, right? But instead we have nothing, and instead we have the police and we have prisons, and the prison system in the United States is the largest mental health care provider. It's completely upside down and backwards, right? So with the second question, I've written about this, especially in light of the events on January 6th, because that's an example of an event that has elicited a certain kind of response, and the response has been to see the events of January 6th as evidence against the political line that was being put forward by the Black Lives Matter protests, right, of last spring and last summer, right? So we have this kind of massive shift in public consciousness where people are finally becoming open to hearing what Abolish the Police is about. People, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis, people have been talking about this for decades, but it was always considered a very fringe position. And suddenly it comes out into the mainstream and people are talking about it. And then with January 6th, there's been a kind of reversal of like, oh, wait a second, doesn't this show that we actually need a pretty robust criminal justice apparatus? I think it shows the opposite. So for one thing, the FBI, various intelligence communities did not have a lack of awareness about what was going to happen, right? Figures in the FBI have used the event to suggest that they need more leeway to surveil, that the tattered civil rights protections that exist are too much. But anybody with a Twitter knew that this was going to occur, right? So that idea is totally, we don't need a massive intelligence infrastructure to know about white terrorism, right? We need Twitter, basically. But beyond that, we know who showed up on January 6th. We know who constituted that mass of white terrorists. A disproportionate number of them were police officers from all around the country. The police in the United States are not in any way a bulwark against white terror. They're an instrument of it. Building up their forces even more, or even sustaining them at the level that they're at, that is the white terror that we're trying to resist, right? That is the white terror that already exists in communities. I think that in order to meaningfully confront, this sort of terrorism that exists outside of that legalized apparatus, Klan members, Proud Boys, all these people. One thing I have to just insist again, right? The police don't do very much to interfere with these folks at all, right? Oftentimes collude with them. So I'm from Philadelphia, and this wasn't specific to Philadelphia, but last summer, you saw there was video, right, of police just kind of hanging out with groups of ne'er-do-wells, white men with bats after curfew, communicating with them, right, working hand in glove together. And this is true, you can see this happen all across the city, right, all across the country, right? So I think that's one of the things about a kind of abolitionist project is really accepting, really looking square in the face at the fact that the police do not play this function of protecting people. They do not protect oppressed communities. They're not even required to. There has been a Supreme Court decision which had the specific result, right, that the police are under no obligation to protect citizens. So they don't play that role. And we need something else, right? And we need the space to do something else. It's grassroots community organizing. We need mass protest. We need mass presence, not to go at it in the streets with them, right? But to outnumber, right, these bands of white racist terrorists, right? But there's the point I want to make is that either we come up with an alternative to the police, or we just have white terrorism taking over. But there's no alternative where the police play this function of acting as a bulwark against it. That's off the table. It's not going to happen. And I think, oftentimes people like myself who put forward, fairly kind of radical politics, were thought of as being very kind of optimistic or pie in the sky, right? But there's also, not a pessimism, but just like a clear-eyed acceptance of the fact that there is no hope in police reform. There is no hope in seeing the police as a force that's going to protect oppressed communities. It's not on the table. And so then the question is, well, what then?
Kira or Krisanne, would you like to weigh in on this as well?
I just want to say that I think that the church can play a real crucial role here. I think getting underneath the, I think getting underneath why we've tolerated this system of revenge and punishment as long as have. And then the alternatives that Vanessa's talking about, I think that the church has a role and really a duty in sharing what that could look like and offering, formation, education, and sometimes physical space, to be that place of diversion and that place of offering settings for healing in ways that, you can keep people accountable, but you can move toward amends and offer just a different way of seeking justice. I think that is a role that the church can play.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly, I second everything that was said by Vanessa and Krisanne. And as far as education and healing, when when I think about alternatives to incarceration and abolition, I think about it in terms of Black and Brown communities, and that incarceration won't help, but we need to get to the root causes of why these things are happening. So then oftentimes that's when you go into violence, shame, isolation, poverty, and address those things. With the white violence, I was sitting here thinking well, what's the root cause of that? But we know, I remember looking at one of the videos with what happened at the Capitol, and one of the protesters, rioters there, for lack of a better term, said, this all started with George Floyd. And a lot of the white, he was just basically saying, because of what happened with George Floyd, and I guess you have this uprising in the Black community, Black people saying they want more power. And a lot of white folks who are causing violence, they're doing this as a way to push back against Black people just gaining more power. So I feel getting to the root cause of white violence is a lot of education, just a lot of anti-racism conversations, a lot of conversations healing conversations between people of color and white folks. I mean, I think that those are some things that more money needs to be put into.
Can I just add another little comment? Because I think Kira raises such an important point. So things that we know about those the folks at the Capitol, the coup plotters, right? We know that they're disproportionately white. We know that a disproportionate number of police were among them, of former military were among them. And the other thing that we know that is extremely important to keep in mind here is that they are disproportionately petty bourgeois. They're disproportionately small business owners who was there. So people like Ashley Babbitt, she and her husband owned a pool cleaning company that was going under. And it's odd, right? Why are they disproportionately small business owners, right? And disproportionately from this kind of, petty bourgeois, meaning small capital class. So we have, as Kara mentioned, we have the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter protests springing up in response to the murder of George Floyd. We also have the slow burn of anti-mask protests. So these people didn't just show up one day at the Capitol. This was the culmination of a whole summer and spring of actions that had occurred at local state Capitol buildings around the country in opposition to mask mandates and in opposition to lockdowns.
So
now,
sorry, just to briefly interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Since we're at time, I want to make sure that I know that Krisanne needs to run, so I wanted to make sure we have the opportunity to thank everybody, and I'm happy to hold the space and continue the conversation more. Absolutely, but I wanted to make sure we gave everybody a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Right. But sorry for interrupting.
No, I think that's a great way to handle it. Yeah. But so I'm happy to go on, or
yes.
I just want to say thank you. I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists and to Steve. And if I could, I would. My son broke his finger, and I have the family car, so I gotta go.
Oh my gosh.
So it was so good to be with you all, and
likewise.
And thanks for this opportunity.
Likewise. Yeah. Good luck with your son. I hope his finger gets better.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Yeah. No, thanks, Stephen. I think that's a very smooth way to handle that. Yeah. But so I'll continue. So this was the culmination of actions that had happened across the country: anti-mask protests, anti-lockdown protests. But these kind of anti-mask and anti-lockdown protests, those weren't the only kinds of activism, right? So of course there was tons of Black Lives Matter activism. The defund demand links together a demand for racial justice with a working class demand, right? Because the demand is that money be taken away from murdering Black people and put into communities, right? To allow people to have the things that they need in order to live, right? So another thing that was striking about the Black Lives Matter protests is how many white people came out onto the streets, right? How electrifying it was, not only for Black people who are often left by ourselves, right, to mourn, but what was different was that there were white people out on the streets in big numbers, and that for the first time in 30 years, you saw poll numbers shifting, where more and more white people were saying, there's a problem. I think racism is an issue, right? So you have these mass politics that are functioning to create a link between the particular struggles of Black people and the shared struggles of working people of all colors. So what is different about this group of people that shows up at the Capitol, right, or that shows up at these anti-mask protests, that they don't join the Black Lives Matter protests, it's because it's that they're white, but there's white people and then there's white people, right? A lot of white people are out in the streets with the Black folks, And I think that that's where it's really helpful to think about the particular class nature of these folks that were showing up at the anti-mask protests. They too were disproportionately small business owners. They often identified themselves as small business owners first and foremost. And they saw themselves as being squeezed between two forces, right? You have big government, quote unquote, that is issuing the mask mandates, issuing the lockdowns. They're seeing that as something that is allowing Walmart to stay open, but their small business has to close. And on the other hand, they're resistant to the kinds of demands that are being made by working class people, because working class people are saying, we want $15 an hour, we want safer working conditions, we want better unemployment benefits, we want to be able to stay home. And so what arises is an inherently and essentially anti-democratic movement of reactionary white, a section of the small business class, obviously not all small business owners, but it's important that this group is disproportionately from that class, right? And when we look at what they do at the Capitol, right, again, inherently anti-democratic, They cloak it in this kind of language of, we are the people and et cetera. But their entire purpose there is to prevent a democratic election. My joke about this is that the Electoral College is inherently racist and anti-democratic. And these people were mad that it wasn't racist and anti-democratic enough, right? That's their complaint. So I think, I think it's important. We have to look at the racial politics, but we also have to, or I should say, and in addition to the racial politics, we have to think about this particular, this like whiteness as this particular kind of class politics, right? A class politics that divides this group of far-right, reactionary, terroristic people, even from the white folks that are out in the streets, right, with Black people in solidarity, trying to have a kind of working class popular movement, right, for people's lives, right? So it's this particular politics of whiteness that not even all white people are embracing, right, but that plays this important role of, I think, offering a kind of ideological cloak, right? It's a bit harder to tell yourself, oh, I'm just trying to overthrow this election because I don't care how many people die of COVID as long as I keep making a buck. But if you cloak it in, conspiracy theory and the glory of whiteness and all this stuff, right, it becomes noble. So I think there's just like this whole interesting kind of nexus of race and class that is at play there.
Thank you so much. Yakira, did you have any other reaction to that, or?
No, Vanessa, thank you. That was like right on.
Oh, thank you.
And with that, I do think we need to stop having this conversation. I wish we could go on for forever. Thank you once again so much. Really deep and thought-provoking. Like, I was really hoping that it would be, while also giving us some, I think, some tangible and practical things moving forward as well. So exactly like I hoped this would.
Oh, good.
So thank you so much. Let's give them one more round of applause.
Thank you so much for this space.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Yeah.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.